So how do you use third parties without introducing an acceptable risk? Well, first of all, you need to know the risk appetite, because if you don't know the risk appetite, it's really hard to know when it's an acceptable or acceptable risk. So the second step, you need to establish the context for using the third party. Establishing the context is a risk management term, but and I will come back to it. But basically, what it means is that we need to determine what are we protecting and why. The third step then would be to set the right requirements. The fourth step would be to ensure that the requirements are fulfilled. And fifth, we need to do that continually, and also we need to keep it documented in a way that satisfies external audits. Now, in my experience, it's the number 1 to 3 that causes the most challenges, and perhaps most of all, number 3, setting the right requirements. That's difficult because it's complex. If you're able to do number 3 right, which also assumes you've been doing number 1 and 2, of course, then 4 and 5 isn't that problematic to do, although it can be very time-consuming, but it's not especially complex. So I will spending most of the time actually on number 3. So we, like I mentioned, we need to look a little bit about the often forgotten governance dependencies. And to look at those, you can just look at how we broke down the challenge. Well, first step, you needed to know your risk appetite. What does that mean? Well, you need to have in place a risk management framework, and you also need to have some sort of information security management system, or ISMS. Because you need to phrase your risk appetite in terms of security. For establishing the context, we need to add some more frameworks, of course. Asset management should be known to all, and I've added a term which is not so much used, which I call value chain management. And I will be getting back to both of them, but I would say that value chain management is, well, for the best asset management frameworks, then value chain management is actually included as part of it. But the key part, of course, of asset management is what we call asset classification. Because if we don't have asset classification, it's really hard for us to understand the criticality of the asset that we're trying to protect. And that would mean that we are not actually understanding the context at the level we should. For setting the right requirements, we also need then a third-party management framework of some sort, because we're not setting those requirements in a vacuum. For example, you can choose to use the Moscow model or some other setup, but it needs to be included, it needs to be ready, and it needs to be a fit for what we're setting. And then the 4th and 5th, the continual ensuring, we also need to add internal control. If we're going to satisfy external audits, we need someone to actually follow up on that. So these things need to be in place, and they need to be at the right maturity in order to just get started. So they are very important, and before we can even start looking at finding right requirements, we need to always ensure that this is in place. But okay, let's assume that this is in place, and looking at the challenge, and then finding the right requirements for the third party. So here is a small process setup. So in this slide, you see that first it comes identify the value chain. So, and then it's identify the assets. Hopefully you can read some of the small black text, but identify the value chain is basically looking at, okay, what are we giving the third party? Are we establishing something new, or is it something old that we had before? And how does it hit our value chain? Directly and indirectly with regards to which kind of accesses they get to our assets, or are the dependencies that affect this in some way. So then you start, then you have the value chain, and you go into those value chains and you look at the assets in those value chain. And usually I would say you should use a broad interpretation of an asset. So even a process is, in this case, considered an asset. And after we've done that, we establish external and internal requirements. Example of external requirement would be GDPR. For example, if we have personal data. Internal requirements would, of course, be the relevant policies that your company has established. Then we create an overview of all that, which comes along from the assets and their classification. And then we do a risk assessment of that context. And based on that, then we see, okay, what do we need here in order to achieve something that is acceptable based on a risk appetite, and we set the requirements. Technically, you could say that establishing the external and internal requirements are part of setting the requirements. But since in many cases and for many companies, they will be in a way non-negotiable, you can also say they are not. But of course, there are the border here is not that clear cut. So basically, as in regards to the last slide, establishing the context is put in these three things or three processes, and then setting requirements is coming need to. But then again, what's the problem or the main problem with this process as the way in which it's set up? Well, basically, it takes too much time. If you have to do this from scratch every time, you're basically going to run out of time. In the ideal world, all of these things are done and you have time to do them, but I don't know how many projects I've been part of now for doing or involving third parties, and I think I've never been part of and where you actually have enough time to do this the way you should. You're often cutting corners. But at the same time, it's clear that all the elements that are described here must be involved each time if you actually want to have that maturity and achieve acceptable risk. So the question is, what can you do? Or you could say, where can this process be optimized by security? It could, of course, be optimized from many perspectives, but of course, we're just now talking about security. So when we talk about the value chain, and also assets, of course, security consultants can obviously go in and document them. But this is, of course, something that the business and the system owner and the people who are working on the relevant system or product or process they should have in place beforehand. So it's really not something we can help much with. And obviously, no one can do anything about the external requirements, but they are often high level, meaning that they need some sort of interpretation. And it's, of course, security that needs to interpret them if they are security related. And security itself owns the internal security requirements. So there we have active control in a way. So it's basically in these three last parts of the process where we can do, and we can hope to optimize things. And what I would like to introduce to you is not something new, but it's the concept of security baselines. But since it's maybe not that intuitive to understand what a baseline means in this context, I just would like to briefly take you through what we're talking about. So what is a security baseline in this context? Well, first of all, it's a set of predetermined requirements. And of course, predetermined here is key because that is where you save a lot of time. But then you have to ask, how can you predetermine? And you can predetermine based on one or more of the following characteristics. So the ones that you are probably all familiar with is classification, which I mentioned before, with some examples here. So for example, strictly confidential, based on the confidential, where you often see the four classical types of levels. So public, internal, confidential, strictly confidential. And then we have high integrity, low availability, and non-repudiation. Most companies will classify according to the CIA, but depending on what you're doing, it makes sense to add more types, like for example, non-repudiation. Then you can also predetermine based on the external requirements. So for example, if you know you are subject to GDPR or the NIS directive, PSD2 for open banking, PCI DSS, or any other, that is also a way to predetermine it. Then the baseline itself is based on the fact that the strongest classification within its class governs. So what that means is, of course, that if you have many assets, let's say you have 10 assets and 9 of them is internal, but the 10th is strictly confidential, the baseline is going to be geared towards the fact that you have one strictly confidential. And the fact that very often when you do this, you will see that the assets sort of max you out. The minute you know that for just one, you don't really have to look at the other classifications because you know that, okay, we have to end up here anyway, or else you actually have to change the solution in some way. So it reduces complexity in many cases. And perhaps the most important point, a baseline in this case is also an already done risk assessment. It means that you have actually, by establishing the baseline, you have looked at the assets involved or the classification of it, and you said that, okay, based on this criticality, this is the risks involved, and we need to ensure that these requirements are being fulfilled. Of course, a baseline then is not necessarily all the parts of the baseline is not necessarily relevant for the product or process you're doing, but that you have to then just make them not applicable. So if we then look at the how the process looks after this, we have sort of added a new step. So we identify the value chains, we identify the assets, we identify external requirements, but based on that, we have enough to select one or several baselines. Now that is a big improvement because instead of doing risk assessment from scratch, when we do go to the risk assess the context and the baseline, what we're doing is we're actually assessing the fit of the baseline with the context. And a lot of the work is put there. So, and this gives us several benefits, which I will go through. So the pros, the first, which I already mentioned a little bit, it reduces complexity. So this is perhaps the main thing that saves time for any kind of third-party project on its own. But the point with the baseline is that it allows for reuse. And that in itself also, of course, is a time-saving factor, but it also allows for two other benefits. The first one is it allows for comparison. So let's sidetrack a little bit. So assuming you have set all the right requirements, that doesn't necessarily mean that the third party will be able to fulfill them. But when you have baselines, it is possible, especially if you're in a large company and you have many third parties, it allows to make comparison on a much larger scale than otherwise. Because in many cases, and I will be getting back to this point, you are in a situation where you might be forced to take on more risk than you would have liked. But at least you can see how much more compared to other third parties who do sort of the same criticality or do a process or have a product with the same criticality. And of course, it allows for benchmarking to see, okay, are there huge differences between many of our third parties? And then in itself, using baselines facilitates maturity. And this is, of course, really important. If you simplify a little bit, you can say maturity can literally be defined as doing the same process over and over again and refining it. Then people would say maybe, yeah, but every third party is unique and the context is unique. So it's not doing the exactly same process. And that's true. But it's countered by using the same baselines because the people who will be doing the assessment and using the baselines, they will be familiarized with them, and they will also see them used in different contexts. See, okay, how would it actually affect the outcome? And they will be better at seeing what is an acceptable end state here. But baselines is not just all positive. They have their challenges. The first one is that using any sort of baseline comes with a high initial setup cost. And depending on the scale of it, what you need to do, it's also you need to invest in tools. And the last point, which is often it's not a problem, but it's underestimated, which is time. It takes time to create baselines, so it's a lot of work before you actually get to see the return of your investment. But it depends. There's a huge difference between creating something that can give a lot of low-hanging fruits benefits or returns towards having a complete set of security baselines that cover everything involving third parties. But how do we create a baseline? Today, most companies already have an ISMS of some sort. And in the ISMS, you could say that contains a library of security requirements. But in my experience, the granularity of the ISMS can vary quite a lot. Often it can consist of mostly high-level requirements. For an example, and I've seen version of this used from what was given from the company I was working for to what we were supposed to deliver in a bid. And I would say that company must have adequate access management in place. So I would argue it's really easy to understand what's the intent of what's said here, but then that's about it, because you quickly run into the question, but okay, what is adequate? Who decides what is adequate? So when we kind of use this kind of wording in setting requirements, my argument that we're doing ourselves a disfavor actually. You can create a baseline of high-level requirements, and it is probably better than having none. For some purposes, it might be fine. But for any service or product where security is really crucial, it is not okay. My general rule for evaluating any type of requirement, how it's phrased and how it says, and this is regardless of domain. It doesn't matter if you're building a hospital, an oil platform, or a security system, is to ask how easy is it to answer the requirement with yes or no? And how easy is it to document that in a way that would satisfy an external auditor? And if you look at this, it doesn't really fit the bill very well for that kind of criteria. So what we need, or we recommend, is that you actually need to also maintain a library of security controls. Now, maybe it's not intuitive that this is the step to go to. And maybe it's because I've been tired of vague formulations, or I've been questioning third parties' maturities and spending too much time on verification that should have already been done. At some point, you end up here, because I also do auditing of third parties sometimes, and then you get to see, okay, but what is a good way of doing this? And often we've seen that using then security controls as answers provides, it just makes everything easier. So, but then some of you, what do I mean by security controls? And specifically, what I've been using is actually NIST Special Publication 853, which is now in revision 5. If you can't read this, I will make it a little bit bigger for the next slide. NIST stands for National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's a non-regulatory agency of the U.S. Commerce Department. And they provide then, of course, guidelines and standards, and 853 is a set of standards and guidelines to help federal agencies and contractors meet the requirements set out by something called FISMA. It stands for the Federal Information Security Management Act. It's a pretty big framework. It's kind of hard to keep up with exactly how you should count it, but I think it's around 1,100 controls if you have the complete set. And I guess that some of you might have looked at it before, especially for using it as part of ISMS. You would be using it together with something called CSF, the Cybersecurity Framework, and that would create a basis for an ISMS. This is also something we do for customers at Mnemonic. And if you come from that direction, then it's also very easy to see that it could be used, or it should be used against third parties. Why? because very often third parties are either adding or replacing your value chains. And then from a security perspective, you can easily see that they should be treated to the same security requirements that were already in place, or what those requirements would be if they should be if they were internally. But back a little bit to what's the good thing about using a security control here. So like I mentioned, a security requirement can often be seen as a question, and the security control can be looked at the answer. So basically, the security controls here are split into families, and they're very detailed. They're very concrete. So for example, account control was usually the first family. They have this disable accounts. So disable accounts within an organization defined time period where when the accounts, and then they say A if it have expired, to B are no longer associated with a user or individual, C are in violation of an organizational policy, or D has been inactive for an organization defined time period. It's very concrete. Something that is a little more complicated, that you need to have privileged user accounts. Well, if you have a critical enough value chain, you should have that. And like I mentioned before, my go-to is how easy is it to answer yes or no to a requirement, and how easy is it to document, and in most cases when you answer yes. And when you look at this, and for anyone with a little bit of security experience, it will say, yeah, of course. It's easy to understand what a yes or no here would mean, and it's also easy to understand if I can be shown. So, okay, do you have privileged user accounts? Well, you can show me easily, and you can document it. So when you get down to this level, instead of having the requirement and putting the exact control as a requirement, you get a lot of benefits for using them in baselines. So, and what are they? Well, first of all, when we've been using this, what we see is that when we, as we often do, we end up in discussion with the third party. It makes the discussion very concrete, and therefore there are a lot more fruitful, just basically because it cuts to the point, and okay, this is something we need, and it's easy to understand, or you can explain why you need it. So it's just simpler. These controls are more difficult to understand for non-security personnel, and therefore they're more difficult to fake. That might seem like a strange point, but very often, especially when third parties are delivering their answers, I don't know how many times I've experienced that the sense that the person who's answering doesn't really know security, and they're using copy paste. And that doesn't exactly invite confidence in the answers. But if you go down into the concrete, then you actually need someone who knows what they're talking about to answer them. So it helps. And in general, when we make the answering less open-minded, and preferably in many cases binary, like I said, it becomes yes no, although we also will need some open-ended questions. It just improves the whole process. It makes it so much easier, and of course verification is also easier to do. And that is one of the things we would like, because we need to be sure of the third party, and what they're presenting us actually matches reality. We don't want to have a mismatch between what is presented and what's actually real. And then, of course, same as with baselines, there are some negative sides to this, or challenges, if you call them that. The same as for the baseline itself. A baseline, it's difficult, or it has a high implementation cost, and using security controls definitely adds to that. So we need the tools in the same way, because if you're gonna have hundreds of controls, which you might need if you have the right criticality, you want to keep it under control. And then this can actually be overwhelming for the third party if they're lacking maturity. And that might be somewhat of a paradox. because from a security perspective, we would just like to avoid anyone who doesn't have the right maturity. But unfortunately, in many cases, that is simply not an option. The real world isn't perfect. But as the saying goes, better the devil you know. For example, I've been working a lot with the finance industry, and in some cases with niche products. And when I say niche products, I'm saying that it could be like maybe 5 third parties who deliver that product worldwide. And you have to choose one of them. And then okay, I'll get a little bit back to it, but the point is that you will not get the answer you like, but at least you will be very certain of the answer you get. In itself, that is some sort of type of control that too. So, and I guess some will be asking, why 853? The first thing is that if you're gonna do this approach, you need to use an established framework. I would say that although it's not impossible for the biggest companies to create and maintain something like this for themselves, for all practicality, it really is impossible. The scope of work will simply be overwhelming. In a way, it also doesn't make sense. Security is a global concern. There are, I would say that at least for public and private sector, there are no one who has a unique need. So pooling our resources into establishing frameworks is what makes sense. And we have decided to use 853 and recommend that because it's mature. It's been around for some time now, and a lot of work has been spending on it. And of course, if you're going to use something like this, you want to see that maturity in it itself. The second point is that it's comprehensive. I think it's hard to say for with the speed of technology developments and security as a domain itself, it's hard to say that anything is complete. It will always need to be how to say reviewed and evolved. But 853 is comprehensive, so it covers most. Well, for most companies, it covers all needs, I would say. And then, of course, that is maintained. You get a lot of free. When it comes to new revision, you just have to update your framework towards that, and then the development that has been done, you have to take in consideration. But you will see then, okay, maybe this control wasn't that well framed, or maybe you should do something. It should be split or actually merged with someone else, and all that will be done for you. But I also, I mean, it is complex when you're talking about anything that has a detail level of 1100 controls plus. It's not something that fits for everybody. So maybe you could say that this, although the principles are relevant for all companies, and of course, security as a domain is also have the challenge that it's not the size of your company that decides what kind of security you need. It's the criticality of the product and service you do. So in many cases, a small company will have as strict security requirements as larger companies. But of course, if you have many third parties, this is more obvious a way to go. But principally, the idea here works for a company on any size, but of course the scope will have to be really different. And then to finish off, like I said, this is not theoretical. This is something I've implemented and tested out. So I want to finish with some lessons learned. The first one is basically what I mentioned first. Ensure that your organization has the right maturity and also in the essential non-security frameworks. And basically, the reason that is so important is you want to avoid problems that will definitely delay your implementation of this. But in the worst case, it can actually stop it. If you don't have the maturity necessary in all the other frameworks, it is really hard to try to increase the maturity in just the security domain. So a first step here is to evaluate the entire value chain necessary. The second lesson learned is that good security baselines, they take time to create, but they are in most cases static. So when you have created them, they become pretty easy to maintain over time. So just there's a really good time saving. If you decide to go down this road, then preferably start small to test, or you can start with the baseline that can be reused the most. So basically going for a low-hanging fruit strategy. You should in any case never underestimate the need for special security knowledge. Some people have thought that by creating baselines, it makes it easier for the personnel who does the evaluation. Anyway, it does, but it's still too complex that it can't be treated as a checklist that some person with a little bit of knowledge of security can easily do. Unfortunately not. So it's still really important to have that necessary knowledge. And also, this will not in any way create perfection for your handling of third parties. So what you should expect is actually just better understanding. Like mentioned before, life is what it is, and we have to accept that sometimes we will have to take more risk than what we would like to. But what we never should accept is not knowing. And that's the problem I see too often, is that actually the risk is more like a black box, because we don't really know what's going on the other side. And that we cannot accept. We cannot accept that type of risk. So I'll leave this last slide hanging before we go to the questions. The services that we can help you with here and provide that we do, then we can give you introduction to implementing 853, both as part of an ISMS, or if you wanted to use it part of a third-party management. We can do workshop on strategy and implementation of such frameworks. And of course, we have security resources to help with implementation. So it's free to contact either my boss, Yaman, who's head of GRC, or just email me if there's something you're wondering about. Okay, Nate, do we have some questions?
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Torbjorn. That was really, really insightful. So a couple of questions to follow up on that. First of all, large companies with many third parties will surely see the value of this, but what about smaller companies? Is this just as viable for them as well?
Well, you have very different, I would say you have to set very different scopes. So for large companies, yeah, sure, then you can go with a full package. But for small companies, and I would say that for small companies where security is really critical, this way to go is right. But then you set the scope probably just you don't necessarily implement the whole framework. I would recommend getting help into just setting those requirements for that company in that context. So it becomes more of a one-time challenge, and specifically it's so you kind of go away from creating and setting up the whole framework and to just get help into setting the right requirements. And then that's really valuable for small companies, because I think these days, I mean, resource-wise, it's really hard for every company to get the competency you need. But smaller companies are, of course, forced to go out and use third parties to a larger degree. But having help then to really make sure that, okay, the security is in place, I think is really valuable for small companies, and also they can show their customers that they have that sort of maturity there.
Fantastic. And what are some of the main challenges or problems you see implementing something like this?
Well, for large companies, it's really tied into, from a security perspective, the state of your ISMS. because for many companies it will feel strange to jump on a complete new framework if the ISMS is not the same. So then it's the challenge is to see if you can merge them or if you actually need to update the whole ISMS or the whole third-party framework, and that is a huge implementation cost. It's a really large project, and in some cases that might be what's needed, but then you're over a long-term project. And for other, maybe it's fine, but it needs to be fine-tuned a lot. So it will take a lot of time to change the way of thinking in that company, even to get to decision should we go there. So it's not clear-cut based on the maturity of your ISMS.
Fantastic. And time for one more, which is how difficult is it to engage with third parties, especially existing suppliers, to implement something like this?
I would say it's not any more difficult for existing than for new. I've done it for both. I guess it's a little bit. Sometimes it can feel a little bit like a Pandora's box when you give something that's this detailed to existing third party, because especially if you have a suspicion that the third party is not mature, because it would really reveal how immature that third party is then, and so the gap of what you would call acceptable risk, the gap between what the risk involved are many cases is higher than you would have liked. But of course that's a good thing to get it out in the open, and then you can start looking at, okay, what are the mitigating actions that we can do. But it puts a toll on the third party, no doubt about it. If you so the 853 actually comes with predefined baselines. It come with a low and a medium and high impact. So depending on what criticality, you can start using that and just tweak it a little bit for what you look at. But if you have something that critical and suggest that you have to use a medium or a high baseline, and you give that to a small third party, yeah, they not gonna like it. That I can be that honest about it, because it gives them a lot of work. But then again, I guess that's just the way the world is. If we're gonna reach a more common level of maturity all over our value chains, we have to start somewhere. We cannot just avoid it because it's uncomfortable, unfortunately.
Yeah, and we do have 3 minutes left, so I suppose we could. We've just had two more come in, so if we can quickly cover these off.
Yeah, sure.
So NIST 853 is overwhelming. SIG Lite is used a lot. Particularly SIG Lite seems to me like a more digestible set. Do you have any experience with that?
No, not me. Not in Mnemonic. I think we have. I've never used it as far as I know. And of course, it's not that you cannot use. Like I said, you can actually use your own. You can create your own ISMS into a framework for a baseline or ISO 27000. Basically, there are a lot of frameworks that you can use. So overwhelming, yeah. I mean, you really need to. I mean, I guess it's fair to say that it isn't for everyone. So then I would consider thinking out, being really sure what do I need and why, and looking at that and doing assessment of that and see, okay, and also do that assessment for a long term. But I would also say, like, 853 is overwhelming at the very beginning. It's actually not that overwhelming when you have worked a little with it. But it's kind of like, okay, look at 1100 controls. Which ones am I going to choose from this? And some of also a problem with, I guess, when you look at it, is that you can see one control and it's really complex. It's like, okay, are we actually going to do this for ourselves? I mean, or put that requirement on a third party, and then you say, no, we can't do that because we don't do it ourselves. And then some of them are really simple. And of course, but if you do the time just to set the baseline, you can avoid some of the overwhelmingness, I guess you could say, by setting the right baseline. I mean, if you just take it in and don't spend the time in adjusting it, then yeah, I would think there's a big risk that you're overcomplicating it as well. So it needs it's a fine balance here, definitely.
Fantastic. And a really quick one, if you consider the difference between IT and OT, what is your perspective on the NIST control and how they fit to suppliers which provide OT components?
Ooh, that's a big question. I would say that there's a lot of overlap. I think I think for the future there will be more focus on the OT, but it's also I would say that you 853 cover the basics of a lot of things anyway. So it's sort of like finding, okay, what's the basic that applies for OT as well, and then looking at, okay, what kind of extra requirements or extra controls should we implement in the OT environment? But yeah, it's a really big question, and the more I just thinking about it now, I actually want to go into it because I mean I started my career in the oil business, so I'm very familiar with OT in many different forms, but I haven't actually been doing that work for a while. But I will definitely think about it, so I can probably do a follow up. And also we have in my department, we have a lot of people who's working with OT and doing similar work for this, not maybe for third parties, but just in general for ISMS and really looking into the OT perspective.
Well, fantastic. Maybe that's one of the ones that it's a good time to mention. They can reach out to you on the email below, and that's a conversation for another day. But Torbjorn, thank you very much for your time. That was fantastic, and thank you for answering the questions. Everybody who's managed to attend today, thank you so much, and also for your good input and questions. If there is anything burning that you've forgotten to ask, you can, again, as Torbjorn mentioned, reach out to him on the email on the screen. And this presentation will be available shortly on our YouTube channel as well. So that leaves me to say thank you very much and have a fantastic rest of the day. And we hope to see you in the next webinar. Bye, everyone.